Well, good. Hopefully, you've all had a chance to take a look at the introduction of Pagel's book, which is I find it, for a scholar, she writes very, very accessibly and offers a lot of nice, side information that really helps to contextualize the Gnostic Gospels. Um, we talked about her last time. This is who we're referring to, Elaine Pagels. I think I mentioned last time that she studied with Helmut Kester at Harvard, which is the only credential you really need in the 20th century for a New Testament scholar. But I came to know about Pagels through reading one of her husband's books, and this would have been in 1987. He was and at this time, quantum physics and uh, just quantum physics and oh gosh, what's the name of it? Astrophysics came to be just started to be introduced to the general public. And he as well was a fairly accessible writer, but you probably heard last time that he died in a mountaineering accident. So he was apparently a very adventuresome guy. Pagels has a lot of books that she's written. This is probably one of her earliest. In fact, the Gnostic Paul only precedes it in 1975. But if you look at the span of time there, she's been writing for 50 years, most of those spent at Princeton University. And when we met last time, I offered a kind of a paradigm or a lens through which we could look at Gnosticism itself. And this has been informed by two books that I've been reading and I've been kind of enthralled with. However, they Margaret Barker is kind of on the margins of Old Testament scholarship, but not so much on the margins that she can't get someone like Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, to write an introduction for her or to write a blurb for one of her books. But her main focus, and just very briefly, is that in the first Temple of Solomon, there was a kind of a mystical element that went along with the high priest entering into the Holy of Holies and having a kind of apotheosis, becoming one with God, the Shekinah of God, represented by the incense of God, overtakes the high priest, and upon returning to the world, he is able to bring that knowledge and that wisdom to the people. Her argument is that the temple was constructed in such a way as to reflect the 6 days of creation, and the Holy of Holies represented that place that preceded time itself. And that when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, um, he was in an atemporal realm that was the same as the the essence of God prior to creation on the first day of creation when God said, "Let there be light." The veil itself represents creation, and it's represented by the colors that of the curtain itself represent the four elements of the earth. And when he comes back through the veil, he brings that light. The high priest brings that light into the created world and ultimately to human beings and to, well, the Jews in this case, the Israelites. Now, this is really interesting to us because this has a very profound mystical aspect to it, right? That God can be known through an experience that involves transcending this world. And it is available, well, it's mediated by the high priest in the first temple period. Her argument is, however, that, and she backs this up again by referring to the visions that particularly Isaiah had of God in the Holy of Holies. Holy, 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 God on his throne. And of course, Isaiah being his mouth being touched with coals, and then there being a kind of an atonement that happens as a result of that. And he God says, "Who may I send?" And Isaiah says, "Send me." And Isaiah takes that knowledge of God back into the world. Something very similar happens in Ezekiel as well. Her argument, however, is that by the end of the 7th century, during the uh, reign of King Josiah, Josiah was a boy king, basically, who was raised and taught by priests in the temple. Uh, that there was a new movement that wanted to focus on the written law as the place where you could experience God's presence. And following the law was the way that one came to be atoned before God, right? And it's all represented in Deuteronomy 28, and I read that last time. Deuteronomy 28 says, if you do this, you will be blessed, and if you do not, you will be cursed, which lays down a very, very specific way of living in the world. Follow God's law, and God will bless you. Transgress from God's law, and God will obviously curse you. And in Deuteronomy, the cursing section is twice as long as the blessing section. So those writing the book of Deuteronomy, they would have been these high priests that we're talking about, these priests that we're talking about around 640 to 609 BCE in Jerusalem. It was a type of social engineering, if you want to look at it from a Marxist perspective, that was happening, where control over the people was going to be mediated and mitigated through the law itself. And so now the place where one comes to know God is in the law. Barker's argument is that after the Babylonian captivity, yeah, go ahead. Oh, Will, question? Oh, no, never mind. Barker's argument is that after the Babylonian captivity, much of that first temple mysticism was lost. And when people tried to, reclaim it or redevelop it, it was quashed. You might remember that in the Babylonian captivity, the question was, how should we worship God? And there was one faction, a very strong faction, who said, we need to really focus on the law. And so people would gather in the synagogue, they would read the law, and the folks would have their marching orders, basically. When they returned, when the Jews returned from Babylon, not all the Jews, but when the Jews did return from Babylon and tried to rebuild the temple, the focus was not so much on the temple as it was on Ezra reading the law and at the gates of the temple every day. People would come and they would stand in the presence of God, almost literally, by hearing the law recited. There was, however, and this is where it's relevant to us, there was, however, during the Babylonian captivity, a tradition that develops that we have evidence of in the Old Testament known as the wisdom tradition. And what Barker would say is that this wisdom tradition, which develops during the Babylonian captivity and thereafter, is really an attempt to try to reclaim or to redevelop the original temple mysticism of the first temple, where the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies that we just talked about here. And when you read some of the wisdom books, you can get a sense of this very clearly, especially when you read Proverbs itself. And let me just read the section that's really important for this argument. The idea is that God's wisdom is the means through which the world was created. And that wisdom is accessible to those who will simply follow her voice. And that wisdom is present in God's creation, but it is also present in the teaching of one who is wise. And so let me read, if I can, wisdom, the Proverbs. Now, this would have been written, shortly after or during the Babylonian captivity. It's all part of this tradition in Judaism called the wisdom tradition, which includes Ecclesiastes, the book of Proverbs, a lot of the Psalms, as well as the book of Job. And I'm probably forgetting something in there. But listen to some of this language, and as you listen, also imagine what you know about the first chapter of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all that was created came through the Word itself. And the Word became flesh and pitched his tent, literally, pitched his tent among us. A lot of imagery of the temple there, right? The tabernacle, tabernacled among us. The Word becomes flesh. But hear about wisdom here. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts long ago, ages ago. I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth, when there were no depths, and I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he had not yet made earth and fields or the world's first bits of soil, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters might not transgress his commands. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. And now, my children, listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. Happy is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my doors. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But those who miss me injure themselves. All who hate me love death. Wisdom has built her house. I'm going to skip down here. And says to the people, you that are simple, turn and hear. Come to those without sense, she says. Come, those without sense. I'm sorry. Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the way of insight. Uh, this is going to be very similar to what we're going to see in the Gnostic tradition. You might remember that Gnosticism, the word gnosis, it's built from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. The suggestion is that knowledge is the key to salvation, that the real problem is not so much sin as it is the illusion that we live in this world. If we were only taught God's wisdom, we would aspire to be one of the angels and be like God. So wisdom can be seen and experienced in creation. It can be taught as well by one who is wise. But at the same time, it's really important to note that wisdom here is a female character. Hakma is the word in Hebrew, and it's translated into Greek as Sophia, and both of those are feminine nouns. So the suggestion is one that many might find heretical, that in the beginning, the first to be begotten, the first to be brought forth was female wisdom. Now you can see if you translate that to John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and this is a Greek concept, logos, which is in many ways parallel to the idea of wisdom, but a little more two-dimensional, I should say. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were created through him. And the Word became flesh and tabernacled or pitched his tent among us. So when we read the Gospel of John, we can at least see some allusions right from the very beginning to this wisdom tradition that traces its, beginning all the way back to, the sixth or the fifth century BCE. Um, any questions about that, first of all? Well, I included this image from William Blake because it really represents in pictorial form um, the conflict we have here. You might remember that when Job, this is from Job, uh, when Job is inflicted by all of his, all of the tragedies that befall him in life, he's visited by three of his friends. And Job in this scenario really represents the questions that he asks throughout the book of Job, really represents the wisdom tradition itself. This mystery that transcends human understanding. You know, where were you when I, just like the Proverbs 8 said, when I drew the circle around the earth, where were you when I was holding back the ocean? God says to Job. These mysterious questions that can only be answered by a kind of communion with God, that Job has in chapter 38. But who do the friends represent? The friends very clearly represent the Deuteronomistic uh, perspective, right? Look, the formula is very simple. If you bless God, God will bless you. If you curse God, God will curse you. This is what we see in Deuteronomy 28. And the friends can't think of it in any other way. And here they are in Blake's, rendering, pointing their fingers at Job, saying, "It's you're the problem, bud. You must have done something." And Job is insistent. I've been utterly righteous my whole life. And this really develops the whole question of theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? And ultimately, these mysteries cannot be known. Um, a more simplistic view is, well, you obviously did something wrong, right? Uh, we even see this in the New Testament, by the way, when Jesus' disciples are talking to him and they see a man who's handicapped on the side of the road, whether he's blind or crippled, I can't remember the context. But the question really becomes, Master Jesus, who sinned? Was it this man that this, that he was befallen by this tragedy in his life, or was it his parents, or was it his parents before that? And Jesus answers that, that they're thinking two-dimensionally about this whole thing. But the idea is that with the Deuteronomistic tradition, if you were in hot water, you were the one who poured the bath, right? It's God is punishing you for something. If your life is great, then obviously you're in the right with God. And the whole wisdom tradition is just going to challenge the simplicity of that. So now, are any questions about that? Comments that you'd like to make? Well, this wisdom tradition, and this is a place that I have to admit that I'm in the recent study I've been doing, I'm there are still some places where I've not been able to connect. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Well, I always think of William Blake and his poem Tiger and the line Tiger, Tiger,
Yeah.
burning bright. But is this the same William Blake?
Yeah, yeah, right. What immortal hand or eye could
Yeah.
form thy fearful symmetry? This is
Did
Blake was a mystic himself, right? And no doubt was drawing on a type of wisdom tradition. You know,
is
this
this a painting?
this is from the Book of Job. This is the
Oh,
when Blake wrote
ah,
he illustrated the Book of Job, and some of his illustrations are just Well, I was teaching about Job this earlier in the fall, and this one woman said, "Man, I just don't like these." You may have been in that class. I don't like these. They they give me a bad feeling. Well, he's accomplished his task. Yeah.
Oh, thank
But
you. Thank
that's a great insight though. When you just think of that tiger tiger burning bright in the darkness of the night, in the splendor of the night, whatever, what immortal hand or eye could form thy fearful symmetry? And
I think it was in the forests of the
in the
night.
forests of the night, okay. But the real question is, here's this absolutely beautiful animal, right? Um, but just a killing machine. You can't think of a more beautiful, symmetrically created animal who is at the one time beautiful and terrible, right? What immortal hand or eye could form? And Blake was always, kind of consumed with these kinds of questions, right? But he himself was a mystic and that gathered a great following that upon his death they had people at his deathbed awaiting some sort of great wisdom from above because he had become such a mystical leader. But I'm getting off track here.
Well, and I wanted to add, Dan, I remember Darrell Lloyd reading and teaching the William Blake poems in Fellowship Hall at First Pres, maybe around 1980 or something. Does
Hmm.
anyone else remember?
Before my time.
Well, it's stuck with me.
Yeah. Well, Blake is a good one, especially as we study Gnosticism, because Blake was a Gnostic, basically. I don't think he called himself that, but he would have fit into that tradition. Now, I was going to say that there's a part of my study of the wisdom tradition that I'm becoming confused about because of some recent reading that I've been doing. But the idea is that wisdom is available to those who, and this is a Greek idea, right? This is a Pythagorean idea. For we can see the presence of God in creation, the order of creation, this fearful symmetry, we might say, gives us some knowledge of God and could be sufficient for helping us to understand the wisdom of God. This, by the way, is an idea that the 20th century theologian Karl Barth had no time or no respect for. For Barth, it was only through the Word, Jesus of Nazareth, not through the Bible. It was only through the Word that God could be known. Um, but something happens in the third to the second century where this idea about wisdom being available in creation comes to be sequestered, you might say, in the apocalyptic tradition. There were those who were saying, yes, God's wisdom it can be found in creation. However, creation itself and humanity is so marred in iniquity that this wisdom is now utterly obscured. Therefore, it takes a special kind of revelation, a vision, in order to get a sense of this wisdom. And that this brings us right up to, the time of Hellenization in the late fourth century BCE. Um, and more, the Jews living in Jerusalem and Judea, the outlying areas there, uh, are coming to get this sense that the world has lost its foundation and God cannot be known in just our day-to-day experience. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But wisdom is now obscured by iniquity. And so now we have two poles, we might say, and it's summarized very well in this quote Another book I've been reading is John Collins, The Apocalyptic Imagination, and where he really takes a deep dive into the origin of the apocalyptic texts going all the way back to Daniel, and then even into the second century of the Common Era. So they're not just Christian apocalyptic texts, there are a great number of Jewish apocalyptic texts. But there are now two poles that are open to the Jews. In Sirach, Sirach is one of these apocryphal books that was written, I think, in the first or second century of the Common Era. In Sirach, wisdom sought a resting place and found it in Jerusalem and was identified with the book of the law of the Lord. So there's one option. Wisdom can only be found in the book of the law of the Lord. This is the Deuteronomist suggestion. However, in Enoch, Enoch is one of the first apocalyptic texts, that develops over a number of centuries. By apocalyptic, I mean having a vision of where the world is going and what's wrong with the present world. In Enoch 41, wisdom found no place where she could dwell, so she returned to heaven and took her seat with the angels. She, again, from the Proverbs, wisdom who dwelled with God, found no place where she could dwell on earth, so she returned to heaven and took her seat with the angels. This illustrates nicely the fundamental difference between the wisdom tradition and the apocalypses. Both find wisdom in the order of the universe, but for the apocalyptist, this wisdom is hidden and obscured by iniquity on earth, and so sets up the context in which, if we are going to know God, it must come not through any kind of knowledge of what happens on earth, but through a special vision that comes from above. And this is the foundation for Gnosticism. Any questions about this or comments? And I really hope this is clear, because the last thing I want to do is confuse everybody on this. Okay, let's see, I'm going through the list here. Well, what are some of the sources of this iniquity? Well, the first source, of course, is Hellenization, with the Greeks coming into Jerusalem in 332 before the Common Era, and imposing Greek ideas, Greek philosophy, Greek language on the people who were, at this time speaking Aramaic and living quite nicely, thank you very much, according to their Jewish tradition. There were some Jews, of course, who were willing to capitulate and say, "Yeah, we'll become Greeks." Well, there were others who were going to oppose this completely, and this eventually leads to what we know of as the Maccabean Revolt in 167 before the Common Era, where the Maccabeans are just so upset with just uh, the heresy of the Greek soldiers, Antiochus Epiphanes, desecrating the temple, revolt against the Greeks who were living in Syria. They were known as the Seleucids, and are able to wrest control back from the Greeks of Jerusalem for for a period of 100 years. Now, the reason they were able to do this is because the Seleucids in 167 were more concerned with what was happening in Rome, right? You had the rise of the Roman, armies that were starting to create their empire across the world. And so basically they just let the Jews do whatever they want. That created a feeling of corruption in Jerusalem, because John Hyrcanus, excuse me, I should say the descendants of the Maccabees, Mattathias and his sons after him, take control of the temple and create a situation where they place a high priest in the temple who has no priestly lineage that he can claim. Remember, in Judaism, the priest was one that had to descend from priests. But the so-called Hasmoneans, the descendants of Mattathias, just completely jettisoned that whole idea. And they placed a high priest and a king in control of all of Jerusalem. And this really upset a lot of the more traditional Jews that were living in Jerusalem at the time. So those Jews, the traditional ones, felt that during the time of the Hasmonean dynasty, the temple had become corrupt. There was no legitimate high priest in the temple. And the religion itself, the idea of the righteous king, had also become corrupt. And we know how this plays out because we read the book about Herod the Great, right? Eventually, Herod the Great is going to become a king who is put in place uh, of Jerusalem and who is completely illegitimate in the minds of those who are more conservative, right? But Herod was able to claim that kingship by ostensibly being Jewish and marrying Mariamna from, who was a daughter of this Hasmonean dynasty. So all of this to say, by the time 50 years before Jesus, you can pretty much tell that there are some people in Jerusalem who have just had it up to here, right? Not unlike what we're experiencing right now in 2026 in the United States. Some people are just like, this is not a legitimate government, right? I mean, the people who are in charge, they just have absolutely no understanding what they're doing. So what they do, what one group of them does is says, look, the world has become so corrupt, the iniquity of the world, we have to remove ourselves from Jerusalem and go out and follow the law as is expected, because it's through the following the law that you can come to know God, but also to learn about God's wisdom from a righteous teacher. And so this is the group that removed themselves from Jerusalem and established themselves in an area known as Qumran. We believe they were the Essenes, who who had the Dead Sea Scrolls that have recently been, well, in 1947, were recently discovered. And these scrolls really give us a lot of insight into what was going on in the time, just in the 100 years or so just prior to Jesus. Um, and they've given us a lens through which we can come to understand how people were interpreting who Jesus was. Because the people of the Dead Sea community were very apocalyptic. They were looking for the day on which a Messiah, or actually two Messiahs, one would be a warrior Messiah, the other would be a high priest, would come and would wipe out the Romans and reestablish the Garden of Eden, essentially, on earth itself. Now, we know that this didn't happen. The Romans utterly destroyed this community. But this is the beginning of what we call monasticism in the Christian tradition. People removing themselves to the wilderness, so to speak. And it also raises questions about aspects of the Gospels that we know of. John the Baptist, for example, was someone who preached from the wilderness. He was someone who, talked about the day of the Lord that was yet to come. I mean, it seems to suggest that John the Baptist may have had some sort of association with the Essenes. Also, Jesus, prior to his ministry, he goes off into the desert, to the wilderness for 40 days and is tempted by Satan, and then comes back to Galilee and Jerusalem, convinced of his messiahship. But this association and our complete lack of knowledge about it, all the way up until 1947, was was really a detriment to how we interpreted Scripture itself. Um, there's another important aspect of not so much the Gospels, but remember the letters of Paul, which were written probably, 30, 20 years prior to the Gospels themselves. Paul was writing his letters somewhere between 48 and maybe 60 of the Common Era. The first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was written in 70 of the Common Era. So if we really want to get to the historically to historic precedents, we read the letters of Paul. And there was much about the Essene community that involved learning a kind of secret holy knowledge that came from the teacher of righteousness. Now, we don't know if this involved visions or not. We have a difficult time putting everything together. But something in the letters of Paul is really interesting and, to my way of thinking, has not been well explained. Because it seems to me to suggest that Paul himself, in his conversion or thereafter, also had a kind of apotheosis, a moment when he, like Enoch or any of the other apocalyptic, heroes, was taken up into heaven and was given some sort of vision. Um, Paul writes in Second Corinthians, it's necessary to boast. It is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it. But I will go on to various and excuse me, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Visions and revelations of the Lord. This is the kind of thing that we find in Gnosticism. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Interesting. He says that twice, right? Was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. On behalf of such a one, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast except of my weakness. Now, Paul seems to be saying there, oh, I know a guy, you know, when really what he's saying is, this is an experience I had, but he doesn't want to reveal that it's him who did it. But this idea of the third heaven is the kind of thing that we see in Daniel, we see it in Ezekiel, and we also see it in the early apocalyptic texts of Enoch, right? Enoch is taken up into third heaven. He's given a tour of heaven by the angels. He is told, where the unrighteous and where the righteous are going to dwell for eternity. He's given all kinds of, insights into the way and the workings of the world and how history unfolds. Paul seems to be saying here that this also happened to him. So the question becomes, was Paul himself a kind of Gnostic? Did he have some Gnostic underpinnings to his work? So let me stop and see if there are any questions about this. This is where it starts to get fun.
Dan,
Yeah.
just a history question. Who were the Jews that were trapped on by the Romans on the top of Masada? And is this in any way connected with the Essenes and those who were escaping, Jerusalem, or was that strictly a military?
No, those were the zealots that were there, of which um, Josephus, who is the historian, the Roman historian who wrote about the antiquities of the Jews um, and the Jewish wars, he was one of those zealots. However, the connection with the Essenes is that this would have happened around 66 AD, 66 to 70, which would have been the time that the Romans had just had enough of the Jews, right? There's so much turmoil going on there. finally, it was Vespasian and his son Titus, Vespasian, who would later become an emperor, um, said, let's just get rid of these folks. They hold siege to Jerusalem. The zealots, they chase the zealots off into the desert. The zealots hold themselves up in Masada, and there, instead of suffering the ignominious death of the Romans, they commit suicide, lest the Romans, take them over. But the time that this was happening would have been precisely the time that the Qumran community on the Dead Sea would have been destroyed as well. The Qumran community was a peaceful community. They were vegetarian. They did everything they could to maintain Jewish ritual purity laws. Um, and now, ironically, they were ironic to the extent that when the Messiah returned, there was going to be a battle to which they had to gird up their loins. And we know about this from one of the texts called the War Scroll that was discovered at Qumran. Uh, no philosophical connection. They were two different groups, but connected in their tragic end by the destruction meted out by the Romans, at the time when the temple was going to be destroyed. Um, Thank you. It's very confusing, because there are a lot of Jewish groups. We had the Herodians, we had the Sadducees, we had the Pharisees, we had the Zealots, we had the Essenes, often in the desert. And then we just have the regular workaday people that were just trying to make a buck, right? Just trying to get by. And that's who Jesus was working with primarily. Um, I want to give you some historical background here because this can be confusing, but the group that we're talking about in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll community, was a Jewish group that preceded Jesus. And the texts that that were found in 1947 contained a number of Hebrew Bible texts as well as non-canonical religious works like the War Scroll and the Community Rule and many other texts. And they were written on scrolls, and they looked like this, if you can see my cursor. Um, they were written on something known as vellum, which was basically sheepskin, as well as there were papyrus scrolls as well. Um, we believe that these scrolls were put in jars and taken off and hidden in the desert just prior to that Roman attack. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are Jewish texts that precede Jesus. Important to remember. Here, by the way, is a nice map if you can see it. Right here, right on the Dead Sea, is Qumran, Jerusalem, about 20 miles to the west. Jericho, believe it or not, Jericho you have an Old Testament Jericho and a New Testament Jericho. Jesus would have obviously known New Testament Jericho. And then the Jordan River. But this is the place where you're probably familiar with this, probably the most famous of images of the caves in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And there were several caves. There wasn't just one cave. It's a beautiful high resolution. This is the best image I've seen of this. And Will, you've been here, right?
Yeah, well, and Denny and who else? Yeah, Greg took us here, and this was one of the highlights.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, these were the jars that contained the scrolls, and the idea was that the Bedouins were out, or the story is that Bedouins were out looking for a lost goat, and one of them threw a stone up into the cave, the way you do, just for fun, and something went clink, and they're like, "Whoa, what was that all about?" He wasn't expecting to hear that. And they went up into the cave, and they found all of these documents kind of rolled up and protected in these clay jars. And if you go back some of them were lucky enough to look like this, right? To be pretty well intact. I'd say maybe 5% of them. There's something known as the Isaiah scroll, which is, you know, fairly well intact. But most of those documents look like this. And so if you're a jigsaw puzzle person, this was a great find for you, but this would drive me crazy. Trying to put up all these essentially shredded documents together. And that was the work that took place from 1947 all the way up to, the 60s. The not, the most of the work was done at that time. Uh, there were other there were other discoveries that were going to be made in 1956 as well. So, but now we have enough of the text to be able to read them in our own language, right? And the texts were written in Aramaic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So we have 400 centuries worth of language development that are available to us here. Now, these are going to be quite different. And this is where our study begins. These are going to be quite different from the Nag Hammadi texts, which were discovered 2 years prior to this, not in Judea, of course, not up and around Jerusalem, but in Egypt. And these texts are dated to the 4th century of the Common Era. So these are 300 years after Jesus. And whereas the Qumran texts are Old Testament based mostly, the Nag Hammadi documents are New Testament based and contain gospels that we are not aware of. So as I write here, the dated to the 4th century, the Nag Hammadi documents are a collection of 13 ancient Coptic papyrus codices, and I'll explain that. Basically manuscripts in book form. They were discovered in Egypt in 1945, and they contain 52 mostly Gnostic Christian texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary, and many, many others. They're important because they provide insight into the diversity of Christian thought in the early centuries of the church. So this is what those texts look like. Basically, leather-bound containers there, like folders that contain these papyrus texts. 13 of these, and in those 13 codices, you have 52 Gnostic Gospels, most of them Gnostic Gospels, that are now open to interpretation. And this is what Elaine Pagels in the late 60s was able to be fortunate enough to be able to interpret. And, in Egypt itself or wherever they were found, there's a lot of political intrigue that went around people who were able to read these things. The Egyptians were very jealous to maintain control of these texts. But eventually, Pagels and her colleagues were able to read and interpret them. This is what a text would look like. They're in a little bit better shape than the Qumran documents, but they're written in a language called Coptic. And what Coptic is the language that's spoken by Egyptians. It's the Egyptian language that's written with Greek letters and something known as demotics, or little points that tell you how a vowel is supposed to be pronounced. And so, two different types of texts, and I know that I have often been confused because they're so similar in, first of all, in the enormity of the influence they've had on just how we understand who Jesus was, the Qumran texts as well as the Gnostic Gospels. But we will be looking at these Gospels. Now, to give you an idea just how inaccurate the internet can be, I was looking for a text on the Gospel of Thomas, which was included in these Nag Hammadi documents. The Gospel of Thomas, as we're going to find out, contains about 75% or so of the material that's found in the Gospel of Mark, almost word for word. But then there's the other, 25 to 20% that is utterly unique to the Gospel of Thomas. So you can see how cherry picking is going on. But the connection with Mark and the fact that it's so closely allied with, the intent and the meaning in Mark, there was a movement back in the late 80s to include the Gospel of Thomas as one of the canonical gospels. There was a book that came out called The Fifth Gospel that was very popular at the time. But to show you just how inaccurate the internet is, I said, I want to find a copy of the manuscript of the Gospel of Thomas. And this thing popped up immediately. And, you don't have to really know how to read Greek that much to see very clearly. This says, Kata Ioannein a Apocryphon, the Apocryphon of John. Has nothing to do with Thomas. This is another one of those books in the Gnostic Gospels, the Apocryphon of John, which is a kind of an apocalypse as well. But really, really interesting text that we'll have a chance to read. So let me stop and see if there are any questions. Well, if not, I can get you to about page 20 of our small Roman numeral 20 of our introduction and give you like an overview of Gnosticism 101. And up until, the discovery of these texts, we didn't know much about Gnosticism as a primary source. We had none of these texts. We only knew what the Orthodox theologians were saying about those texts. For example, Irenaeus in his very well-known book called Against Heresies, he's pointing out heresies and explaining how they are incorrect or misinformed about who Jesus is. And of course, Gnostic texts come up, and in Irenaeus, and we hear about, I think it's the Gospel of Thomas, and so we can only discern from what Irenaeus is saying about the text what was actually in the text itself. Another later Christian apologist by the name of Hippolytus in his Refutations refers to the Gnostic Gospels. But the important thing to know here, and this will connect us with the wisdom tradition, is that if we want to talk about salvation in Gnosticism, salvation comes through knowledge. The real sin in Gnosticism is ignorance. It's living in illusion. It's not the sin of original sin of, concupiscence and that total depravity, which completely makes the human being incapable of knowing God apart from being baptized and, brought into the fold again. This understanding is that it's possible to wash your perception of the world the way you would wash your hands, so to speak, and thereby be vaulted, taken up into a new understanding of God. That being this case, the assumption is that if you know yourself, you can know God. If you know yourself well, you can know God. Knowledge of God is tantamount to knowledge of self and vice versa, which ironically enough is the very first two chapters of John Calvin's Institutes written in the 16th century. But this idea that salvation comes from washing yourself of illusions and perceiving the world as it really is, right? Apart from all the iniquity that obscures our understanding of God's wisdom. This is very similar to what we know of as Eastern mysticism, what we might find in the Hindu Upanishads, or what we might find in Buddhist texts, knowing about the true nature of the world and not living in suffering by through your ignorance as a result of knowing God's true nature. So there are three basic beliefs, and these are found on page 20 of your text. And Hegel's numbers them out for us quite nicely. Number one is self-knowledge is knowledge of God. Orthodox Jews and Christians insist that a chasm separates humanity from its creator. God is wholly other. But some of the Gnostics who wrote these Gospels contradict this. Self-knowledge is knowledge of God. The self and the divine are identical. Second thing to look to. Second, the living Jesus of these texts speaks of illusion and enlightenment, not of sin and repentance, like the Jesus of the New Testament. Instead of coming to save us from sin, he comes as a guide who opens access to spiritual understanding. But when the disciple attains enlightenment, Jesus no longer serves as a spiritual master. So Jesus is a means to an end that you can achieve. That once you achieve that end of perfect enlightenment, Jesus is no longer, the spiritual master. The two have become equal, even identical. And then finally, Orthodox Christians believe that Jesus is Lord and Son of God in a unique way. He remains forever distinct from the rest of humanity whom he came to save. Yet the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas relates that as soon as Thomas recognizes him, Jesus says to Thomas that they have both received their being from the same source. Jesus says, I am not your master. Because you have become drunk from the bubbling stream which I have measured out. He who will drink from my mouth will become as I am. I myself shall become he, and the things that are hidden will be revealed to him. So you, even as I'm reading this, if you have any knowledge of or sympathy for Christian orthodoxy, you can all of a sudden you can be taken aback, right? Well, what do you mean? I'm on the same level as Jesus, and the only thing that's separating me and Jesus, or me and God, for that, for that matter, is my own ignorance. This is obviously very influenced by strains of Eastern mysticism that would have been available to the Greeks. Beginning in about the fifth or fourth century BCE, and thus has probably influenced the Gnostic tradition through Hellenism, and perhaps also through Persian mystery religions. So we have a fun road ahead of us, and hopefully you will not be too offended by what we're reading, but I think I think it will be a fun time. So we'll begin with chapter 1 next week. And keep in mind also that one of the things that Pagels wants to do is look at the idea of the divine feminine, that God is neither masculine or feminine, but there are places in the Gnostic Gospels where God has feminine qualities, right? And this was the original impetus of her work as a graduate student. And so this gospel, this book, the Gnostic Gospels, is going to, take special care to develop that idea. Any,
Dan,
yeah, go ahead, go on.
I feel like I am dining on forbidden fruit, but it's sure delicious.
You are you are dining on forbidden fruit. I mean, Irenaeus is rolling over in his grave, right? But this just demonstrates the diversity of Christian belief in the first century prior to Constantine. It's no coincidence that these documents date from the middle of the fourth century, hidden, in Egypt, probably at the time when Constantine was, going around looking for heretics that didn't comply with his official orthodoxy established in the Nicene Creed. So, other comments? Yes, we are eating forbidden fruit, but it's okay. All right. Well, I'll see you next time, and but we'll have some fun with this, I hope. And if you start to get too overwhelmed, please let me know, and we'll see if we can tone it down a bit. Okay. Well, I will see you all next time at the same bat time, same bat channel, and enjoy.